Hello, everyone, and welcome. Those of you on YouTube, those of you on Zoom, I'm Karina Robinson, and I'm co-director of the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics with my colleague, Associate Professor Grace Lorden. This new research centre at the LSE launched only a month ago, and it brings together behavioural science and data to create more inclusive cultures. Over the next year, you can expect a steady stream of rigorous and relevant research from the Inclusion Initiative. We're currently working on a number of fantastic projects. They range from exploring how artificial intelligence can be used to promote inclusion in the workplace, to considering how luck versus effort is attributed across groups, to quantifying how COVID-19 has affected workers in the UK and what can be done to deal with this. On the admin front, do follow us on Twitter at LSE_TII or sign up to our newsletter. And that's going to be on the chat function. This event is recorded, and what we would very much like is wonderful questions posed on the chat box, and we will answer them in the last 20 minutes. Now, this is the third of our Open Door, Open City webinars. And the name, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? We aim to open the door to the city and to business, to all talent, and to make sure they're included. That is the best way to breed a culture of openness, to breed a culture of productivity, of collaboration, and ultimately profitability, which is what allows firms to survive and prosper. We're very lucky today to have as our guest Vivienne Artz, Chief Privacy Officer at Refinitiv, a financial data company, and President of Women in Banking and Finance. We're going to talk inclusion, the future of data, and privacy. Vivienne, a very big welcome to Open Door, Open City.
Thank you so much, Karina. Absolutely delighted to be here today. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
First and most exciting, or maybe just for us, but I should hope for the city itself, would you like to elaborate on the work Women in Banking and Finance and the Inclusion Initiative are doing together?
Oh, I'd be delighted to. Thank you so much. So Women in Banking and Finance have launched their first research program ever. And we're absolutely delighted to be collaborating with London School of Economics, particularly Dr. Grace Lorden, and also the Wisdom Council to bring this to life. So it's a 4-year program, and the first part of it is looking at the phenomenon of the missing middle. So the challenge for us really is that the UK financial services sector is facing a skills shortage crisis, the cost of which is estimated to be about 90 billion by 2030. Meanwhile, we've got highly skilled, high caliber and experienced talent pool, and they're leaving the industry in significant numbers, mostly women. Too few women get to the top, and we know that concept of the permafrost, which is the mid-tier where women don't progress or they leave the sector. And we're also finding that the gap between male and female employment in financial services is around 150,000, and it's risen steadily since the 2008 crisis. And although we're doing a great job at ensuring that we get a balance of men and women at the entry level, the likelihood of women progressing to senior management within financial services is worse than in any other sector. So the work that we're doing with the LSE, we're really excited about, because it is going to come up with some practical recommendations around what our members and organizations can do to actually address the missing middle. So the phenomenon we've known about for a long time. And in fact, when I became president of Women in Banking and Finance, and what generated this effort was I went to members and I said, what are the two things that are worrying you most? And one of them was around how do we demonstrate a return on investment for our D&I spend? And the other one was talent. It's leaking. We've got them coming in, and we're doing our best to promote them up, but we're just leaking in the middle. So what do we do about it? So that's the initiative that we're working on together, and really excited. So we launched our initial survey findings at the London Stock Exchange Group virtual market opening on the 26th of November, and a bit of a sneak peek on that. One of the initial findings was that, guess what, women don't lack ambition, surprise, surprise, but what they do lack is opportunities. And so that's what we're going to focus on.
That is wonderful, Vivienne. And actually, on a personal note, I think, you were at that sort of stage when you were at Citibank. Did you ever think of quitting? And if so, why? And what made you stay?
Oh, that's a personal question, isn't it? Yes, I think there were times when I really did want to leave. And I stayed because I was ambitious. I stayed because I looked at the opportunities elsewhere, and actually I felt that Citi offered the better opportunities to grow. And I stayed because I'm resilient. And I think so many women are very resilient. So yes, there were frustrations and there's times when you do feel you want to go, but I think resilience and being able to create some of those opportunities. So one of the things I loved about Citi was that because it's so big, it did offer opportunities. You had to often make them yourself, but the opportunities were there both internally and externally. And I think that's quite an important distinction as well. The internal opportunities may not always be as readily available, but if an organization is willing to offer you external opportunities, then that can often make all the difference.
Yes. At the Inclusion Initiative, we have a very clear definition of inclusion, which I'll read to you just to see if it's something you agree with. So we say that within the firm, diverse voices should be heard in collaborative discussions, and leaders must work to bring the missing voices into the firm to aid its purpose and profitability. Do you agree?
Yes. And it's about identifying what voices you are missing and how do you actually bring them into that discussion. I think that's absolutely important because too often I think the loudest voices are always heard. And if the room is full of noise, then you don't stop to question, where is the silence? Where are you not hearing from? Because the loud people will always fill up all the space. And so I think often it's very difficult for firms to recognize what they're missing because they're missing it. And it's interesting. I think we were talking as well a little bit just about where D&I should sit and why it's so important. And I think one of the challenges that many firms face is that they haven't recognized what they're actually missing.
That's a very interesting statement, because until you have those other voices there, it's very difficult to understand what they can bring. And is this one of the reasons? Because, you and I have been in financial services for a long time and preoccupied with D&I. And now, you have all these McKinsey studies, Harvard Business School studies, proving that the sustained profitability of firms is better when you have an inclusive, diverse organization. And yet we still have to be out there shouting about it from the rooftops. Why is this?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? You would think that the business case would do it. And I've thought about this a lot. So initially, I've sort of felt it was fairness. It's so obvious. Women are 50% of the population. It must be a fairness issue, and that's going to strike the chord. And it resonates intellectually, but it doesn't really make any difference. It's quite a difficult one for most people to adopt. And then it's the business case, which is it's so obvious. Firms operate better, staff are happier, you're better reflective of society, and actually firms seem to be more resilient as a result. So surely it's the business case. And there's like, yeah, it is the business case. But again, we're struggling to see that firms actually take that forward. And I think the one that perhaps is resonating more now is talent. And the opportunity piece, which is actually, what you're missing out on is the talent. And actually, you're not very attractive as an employer. And I think about when I was looking to change roles, one of the things that was really important to me, I talked about it for years, and I thought, I've got to put this into practice. And actually, how important is it when choosing a new firm to work for that they have a strong track record on D&I, and that they are willing to be open and to actually respect everybody as an individual. So you can bring your full self to work. And I realized actually it's really, really important. And a number of roles that I was looking at, I then dismissed because I said, honestly, it's not going to be the culture and the environment where I want to work. And I think finally firms recognize in the battle for talent, you've got to have something to offer. So at Women in Banking and Finance, one of the things we do on our job board is we ask our members who post to set out what are their D&I policies, what are their targets, how successful are they. We ask them to showcase their D&I credentials because actually that's what our members want to see is this the right fit? Money doesn't cut it all the time, and particularly with the new generations coming through, that's not the main driver. They're much more focused on firms that are providing opportunity and that are purpose-driven and where the culture is going to work. So I think it's the talent piece that perhaps is going to finally get us there.
Now, to enhance inclusion in the firm, we all have different views, but I think I say you need targets, you need accountability, you need mentoring, sponsoring. I also very much believe that you need to tie managers' pay. They have got to be, their compensation has got to reflect what happens in the D&I piece so that they actually realize it is just as important to the firm as their client work. Do you agree with this?
I think it's a very powerful driver for our sector. I don't think it necessarily translates across other sectors. But what I do feel is really important is that the ambition of the firm to be diverse and to be inclusive can't be one that sits with HR. It can't be one that sits with the board. It has to be one that sits throughout the organization. And then we need to think about, well, how do we make people own it? And I think the way you make them own it is by linking it to compensation, is by linking it to targets, so that it's actually everyone's responsibility. Otherwise, it's always somebody else's responsibility. And I just don't think that there is the impetus. Sometimes when people, I love that phrase, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And the number of times where something good on D&I has come forward, but it hasn't come through for the reason that you hope. It's come through for some other reason. And I always remember, don't look the gift horse in the mouth, you've got it, so move forward. And I think that there is still very much the case that intellectually, firms, managers throughout the organization understand it, but they don't actually believe it. And so that framework, which gives them direction on how to do this effectively, is the way to go. Because going back to the point we made right at the very beginning, until they see it, they won't know what they're missing. And for many of them, it's like, I don't see anything missing here. Actually, it's all, you know what, it's all working just fine. So I don't see why you want me to change it. And so sometimes we have to facilitate that change. And then there's a new belief. Yeah. And I remember actually when I went to I joined a senior leadership team once, and one of the comments from the male colleagues was, now that we've got like 2 or 3 women, it's really changed the dynamic here. And this is so much better. Like, we didn't think there was anything wrong with us before, but now that we have diversity, actually, we really prefer it, which I thought was just a hugely, hugely powerful comment.
Absolutely. Let's move on to privacy and data. You form part of the International Regulatory Strategy Group, IRSG. It sounds far from exciting, let's be clear, but the regulation of data is actually among the most exciting or perhaps the most worrying issues in the world today. Could you explain what the IRSG does and what its recent report talking about localization noted that was of concern?
Oh, thank you so much for that one. I love to explain what we do in the data work stream. So I have the pleasure and the privilege to lead the data work stream at the IRSG, International Regulatory Strategy Group, which is part of the City of London. And we have been looking at data, mostly from the personal data perspective, for a long time. And there's been a huge amount of legislation. We all know about GDPR, et cetera. What's interesting is that data protection legislation isn't just about GDPR. 2/3 of the world now has privacy legislation. And you would think that that would create a better framework for data sharing, given that so many countries now have data protection laws. And actually what we're seeing is quite the opposite. It's much more fragmented. And what we're also seeing post the financial crisis is an increase in behaviors by both legislators and regulators across the world to require data to be localized or to create barriers to data sharing. So that could be banking secrecy laws, outsourcing restrictions, privacy laws, all sorts. There's some interesting examples. I mean, traditional data localization jurisdictions are China, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. But now we're seeing a huge swathe of jurisdictions where data is being localized overtly and by implication. So, you know, the recent decision between the EU in the EU about the US, the Schrems II Privacy Shield, knocked down the Privacy Shield and has meant that, you know, the biggest flow of data for Europe is to and from the US. And now they've knocked down one of the biggest mechanisms to enable that. And the follow-on guidance that's being provided is just incredibly onerous, that the impact is effectively to localize. So the importance of the report really was to raise people's awareness of why data is being localized, often to protect data, to create local jobs, to ensure regulator access, but actually it often doesn't achieve that end at all. And so the recommendations in the report were really around other ways of doing it. So thinking about data in the bigger context. So for the UK, in 2018, I think the value of the digital trade was 190 billion. And financial services took up 89% of that, which is absolutely huge. We need data. We need the free flow of data to facilitate business, innovation, and trade. Absolutely critical. So how do we go about it? And our recommendations are really around how do we achieve a better flow of data? And that's through mutual recognition, not seeking equivalence, but seeking an outcome-based approach for the protection of data and access to data by regulators and such like, as opposed to locking it down. Instead, let's just raise our standards and find out where our commonality is and create those good standards, as opposed to putting it all under lock and key, which is not really helping anyone.
Why isn't it helping anyone?
When it goes under lock and key, the difficulty is that we're unable to access it. So what we're finding is that we need data to feed AI. We need data to grow. It is literally the driver of business. COVID-19, I think, has also led us to exponentially embrace the digital world. It is very much data-driven. They say that data is the new oil. I don't think the analogy works exactly, but I think the message is absolutely
The new
clear.
wind, maybe, or the new sun. Perhaps that's better.
It is. And the responsible use of data is critical, but the free access to data is equally important. And we need to find that balance. And some jurisdictions have got the balance in one way, others have got the balance heavily loaded in the other way. And I think there's certainly an opportunity for the UK to define a middle ground in terms of that balance between how do we protect data and yet enable business and trade, because it is absolutely what we rely on. And in financial services, it's critical, and that's what we do at Refinitiv. We're a data-driven business, and we're all about data. It feeds the financial system. It improves our ability to manage risk, to create opportunities, and to serve customers.
But Vivienne, aren't you and the IRSG, I mean, fighting against the tide because we've got more balkanization of the web itself? I mean, what China is trying to do and what other authoritarian regimes are looking at is actually the whole idea of the World Wide Web and this free flow of information is something that goes against a lot of the countries where the leaders are not necessarily democratic. And how are you going to work with these countries to make make the ideal solution come out of it?
Well, I think we're not trying to change the world. What we're trying to do is raise awareness of the challenges and the opportunities, and to encourage the UK and others to recognize where the opportunities lie and to address them so that we can actually um, create an environment where we can all thrive. So the UK, for example, entered into the CEPS agreement or SEPA agreement with Japan, and they had an explicit provision in there which said, look, we're not going to localize data. We are absolutely going to hold ourselves to high standards of data protection, personal as well as non-personal data. But we understand the importance to both of our economies and our peoples to ensure that data can flow freely. And we need to continue that approach, not just bilaterally, but multilaterally. We've got some great standards in terms of OECD and Convention 108, where we understand that, or where we have articulated how data should be treated, so that we can facilitate that free flow. Not everyone's going to join in, but I think that there are a significant number of countries and economies that understand the multilateral approach, why that is important, and are looking to find that way forward. I mean, China, at the end of the day, let's face it, they're pretty transparent. There's very much a localization approach, but they're pretty clear about how they use data and how they access it. And really, you get to choose. India, interestingly, with their proposal for restrictions on the flow of both personal and non-personal data, is very concerning. We'll see where that comes out. The US, I mean, they're starting to move toward increased data protections in the positive sense, which is actually everyone is asking us to treat their data better, and we need to start doing that. So, I think it's an impact and an influence that is coming to the fore. And when we see that over 130 countries now understand the importance of protecting data so that we can share it in a responsible way in order to grow our economies, I think that's the positive outcome.
Do you think GDPR really led the way in looking at data differently?
GDPR does look at it very differently. And I think what's interesting about GDPR is that it has married the concept of data protection and fundamental human rights together. And the concepts, right to be forgotten, portability of data, the importance of consent, rules around the roles and responsibilities in relation to data, have been adopted in many other jurisdictions, but the restrictions on transfers, not so much. And the marrying together of data protection as a fundamental human right, not so much either, because from a legal perspective and a cultural perspective, it doesn't sit well with many other jurisdictions. So I think GDPR has come at it with what they feel to be a gold standard, absolutely, and it is a very high standard. But I also feel that it's one that's frankly not achievable or attainable outside of the EU, because it is so highly prescriptive, culturally and legally. The thing is when personal data becomes a fundamental human right, then how do you balance that against other obligations and other requirements? So if it's a fundamental human right, can I monitor your phone calls? Maybe not in your home, that sounds terrible. But what if you're a trader? I need to be able to monitor and supervise what you're doing. So where's the balance? But if it's a fundamental human right, then where do I find the legitimate interest there and the middle ground? And in some member states, it's very difficult to achieve regulatory obligations around monitoring and compliance and risk assessments and insights and customer view, that other regulators are seeking. You know, it's that interesting dynamic between regulators want more data and privacy regulators want you to do less with data and hold less of it. And so there's a bit of a natural tension there. But when privacy is a fundamental human right, you can sort of see where the balance is going to fall, and it'll fall much more closely toward the human right element than it's going to fall toward the business side or societal use or using data for good.
Okay. There's been a backlash against big tech, and it's been going on for a while, but we haven't really seen much action other than the EU. But now we've got the US. There's a case in the US now. You've got cases US, UK, EU, and also an attempt to come up with new regulatory approaches. I mean, can they succeed? Are we actually going to see something like Facebook using data more responsibly, and maybe the breakup of firms like Facebook? Or is this something that is just going to be in the courts and discussed a lot for the next few years, but nothing's going to change with big tech's power over data?
I think big tech is recognizing that they have to change, that they perhaps don't have the level of support for some of their practices that they had. It's not to say that they're irresponsible. You know, big tech try their hardest to be very responsible, and they have some excellent practices. But in the recent Senate hearings on the Hill a couple of months ago, they were very critical of some of the things that goes on in not just big tech but social media, as the case may be. And I think, you know, they're as the big tech companies, they're having to respond to the evolving landscape, which I've referred to: data localization, enhanced awareness of privacy, demands from customers. Actually, I need you to tell me, I need more transparency. What are you doing with my data? I want to know. Where is it going to? Who are you sharing it with? Why are you sending me these messages? Those sorts of things. And I think they've shifted. So when the California legislation came out, which was very strict in terms of privacy, you know, as a big tech didn't fight it. They helped to shape some of the pieces which were perhaps a little bit incoherent, but they didn't fight it. And I think that there's a recognition that the tide has turned, and that we all need to be protecting data, and we cannot be cavalier with other people's data or even with our own. And you know, there's a lack of tolerance for data breaches and data misuse. There's just a huge fine yesterday. I think the French CNIL fined 100 million to one of the firms and 40 million to another. The UK ICO has been very vociferous in terms of Marriott and BA. So I think it was 90 million and 180 million were the intended fines. They've reduced those now, but I mean that's punching hard. That's really saying, that's sending a message about what will be tolerated and what won't be tolerated. And actually, a lot of firms need to be thinking quite carefully about tidying up their data practices and making sure that they are responsible and transparent and listening to what their customers want, which I think, you know, is good business sense. We should all be listening to what our customers want.
Absolutely. Now we're seeing a lot of M&A activity in financial data. You mentioned, you know, this, as you said, it's an analogy that doesn't hold. It's a new oil, but I mean, basically, it's got huge value. So we've had S&P Global taking over IHS Markit. The other LSE, the London Stock Exchange, is taking over Refinitiv. What is the reasoning behind it?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And what's fascinating is the value attribution to data. So, you know, the S&P IHS transaction, 44 billion, crikey. LSEG and Refinitiv comes in at a modest 27 billion by comparison. But when it was announced, it was like, wow, that's impressive. I think what it does is it demonstrates the importance and value of data to the financial services sector, that innovation needs data, AI needs data. With more data, we can better manage risk. And scalability of data is hugely important, and that's what's giving it that fantastic price label, is the amount of data, the potential for data in terms of analytics and insights, and also, just the volume of data is just so critically important. So yeah, it's very exciting, isn't it?
Absolutely. I only wish I'd had shares in market. But anyway, now, how do ethics fit in with data? Because you've likely obviously touched on it, but it's a very, very important aspect of it.
And an increasingly important aspect. It's incredible to see how many different organizations and institutions and bodies are now coming up with guidance around particularly the ethical use of data in the context of artificial intelligence. And the ethical element, I think, is quite simple, really, to break down in my mind. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And we've got to ask that question to ourselves. So even with strict data protection rules, it might technically be legal or permissible, but really, should you be doing it? And I think we've had a couple of big scandals that have made people think twice. So Cambridge Analytica, for example, around uses or misuses, even if it's technically legal, should you be doing that? Should you be manipulating what people think, how people vote, perhaps even predicting their behaviors? Should we be doing that? We've got to ask that philosophical and ethical question. The other thing, of course, that we're realizing is that with artificial intelligence, it's about the data and it's about the algorithm. And artificial intelligence is fantastic. It's not really artificial intelligence, it's really machine learning. And it can do wonderful things in terms of accuracy and speed and volume and such like. But we have to be very careful what data we feed it and make sure our algorithms are sophisticated enough to anticipate changes and also to reflect what the outcome is that we actually want to achieve. So, for example, if your algorithm says that people earning less than X can never get a mortgage, then you've just said that a whole swathe of society can never own a home. Do you really want to do that? No. So you're going to have to change your algorithm and actually make it a lot more nuanced. The other piece, of course, is the data. We're finding that the data is so biased. So interestingly, Amazon actually pulled a recruiting tool which they had put in place, which was based on machine learning, because they had fed it with CVs of existing senior individuals across a broad range of sectors. And they were quite surprised when they fed in, when they launched the recruiting tool, and it was shortlisting like 95% male candidates. They're like, well, why is it only shortlisting male candidates? It's like, because you taught it with male CVs only. So when it was seeing all of these like women's colleges or anything that related to anything other than the male format that you'd put in, it rejected them. So it's about the data and the algorithm, and that gives rise to the ethical question around, just because we can, does it mean we should? And we have to think quite carefully about what are the outcomes that we want to ensure as well. And I'm actually delighted that we're thinking increasingly in that way. It's not just about profit. It's not just about achieving a goal, but actually, and I think this is very influenced by our experience of COVID-19, is what do we want to look like as a society, and what's right for us? I think it varies depending, between cultures and such like, but what is actually good and right for us?
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because I think COVID has led to a change, to an emphasis on empathy, to an emphasis on the problems we had in society, like inequality, etc., have been made infinitely worse by COVID. So how can we work to try and temper those issues, and in a way that many people before perhaps hadn't had time to think, or hadn't had it presented to them so obviously in these ways. So perhaps, out of tragedy can come a better society, which would be a dream we all have. So in fact, let's return to D&I, which is part of creating a better society. In Germany, they're imposing quotas on companies to see progress in senior directors. Now, in the UK, we have targets. And, you know, as somebody who, when I left the LSE, if anybody had said quotas for women, I would have said absolutely not. In my 30s, I would have said not. In my 40s, I would have said, well, we seem to have a problem. And now, age 57, I want quotas. Now, what about you?
Interesting. I did a debate on this a couple of years ago, actually, and I was very persuaded on quotas, but I'd actually taken up. I was given the non-quotas argument, and for me, it was very much around merit. I didn't want to get there because of a quota, but what was interesting was the audience was swayed by quotas. I actually lost that debate, and I could see why. Which is, you know what, persuasion, logic, business cases, common sense, fairness, and the evidence in front of us should be changing what our society looks like, and particularly the gender balance overnight. Really, is it rocket science? It really isn't. And it isn't. So, you know, I'm always reluctant about quotas because it's that sense of you want to get there on your own merits. You want to have been able to achieve it because of who you are and what you've done or your potential. But perhaps sometimes we do need to go down quotas. And what's interesting is I know they introduced them in Norway and other countries. And, you know, the response was, well, watch out, you know, honestly, the sky is going to fall in, business is going to collapse, it's going to be the end of the world. And it isn't. It never happened. There was never a car crash. And I get where you're coming from. And perhaps if we don't make the progress that we need to within a very short time scale going forward, because I can't handle these sort of, you know, in 100 years time, we'll finally have equality. We're not going to be here in 100 years time. And besides, we've already had a whole bunch of 100-year anniversaries, 100 years of women having the vote, 100 years of women being allowed to practice law, 100 years of women being able to serve in the armed forces. Really? And we're not even equal in any of those. We're not equally represented in Parliament. We're not equally represented in the highest levels of the law, and we're not equally represented in our armed forces either.
Vivienne, it seems to me that, yeah, there's a bit of a quota, a leaning towards it.
And I have to, but you know, and so yeah. I'm with you, which is
frustration. It's frustration. In fact,
if it's the only way, it's the only way.
It's the only way. What advice would you give to your younger self? And then we will turn to the audience for questions.
I think to my younger self, I would say two things. Actually, it's something I did as my younger self, and I would say, yes, do that again. Let's have a 5-year plan. A 5-year plan helps you to think about the future and helps you to focus your energies in the right direction. Don't just bob along in life. Who knows what will happen? And you will not then be focused on what you want to achieve. Have a 5-year plan. You may not make it, and that's absolutely fine. But as long as you've had that ambition and that focus, then you will have something to reflect back on to say, did I get there? Didn't I get there? What do I need to change? So I think a 5-year plan is really important if you're actually going to get on with your life. And then the second thing is to live in the moment. I think too often when we're striving and we're looking ahead and we're growing and we're developing and we're on that journey, that we're always focused on the next goal and where am I going to be, and I'll enjoy it when I finally get there. And life's a journey. You don't ever get there. You've got to enjoy the journey en route. And so to my younger self, I'd say take the time to enjoy every moment of it where you are, and don't always look too far ahead. Enjoy where you are, because today will never come again. So yeah, I'd say take that time.
Very good. Thank you for that. Now let's turn to some of the questions. I understand, now this is one of them. So I understand there's value to data privacy. Don't you think that there are also big downsides to protecting data? Countries with more relaxed privacy laws seem to be making more progress in AI and the technology race. Would you relax the current GDPR rules?
Well, I'm not the government, so I can't. But it's a very good point because, who leads in artificial intelligence and innovation? China and the US. And do they have strong privacy laws? The US has many, but they're, I think the Schrems 2 decision gives you the answer. China, interestingly, has a draft privacy law that's currently being negotiated. Sorry, it's going through their process at the moment. But no, not really in terms of the privacy side of things. I think that there is a middle road. The data piece, having access to the data and the ability to innovate without too many constraints is really important. But the other part of it is really about responsible use of data and trust. And, I think the EU has reflected on how data can be misused in the not too distant past. And that has very much informed their approach to data, particularly sensitive personal data, and rightly so. But they've now very much hitched their horse to fundamental human rights in terms of data. And that does put in place a lot of constraints around how one can use data. So as the UK repatriates a lot of rights post-Brexit, I think there's an opportunity to revisit some of the stuff that we have inherited and see whether or not that really is the way forward. I don't think we're ever going to bin data protection. I think data protection is really important, absolutely fundamentally important, but perhaps ensuring a better balance between what society needs and what business needs, and as well as protecting data, is indeed the way forward. And the UK is very keen to encourage innovation, particularly in relation to AI, and we're doing really well at it. We're third in the world. So we've got to keep that place and maybe move up. And perhaps we are that responsible innovator and hothouse for business that we need in the future.
Yeah. How does one collect fully representative data and manage organizational-wide culture change when they operate globally in countries that have highly heterogeneous ideologies around inclusion and exhibit various levels of tolerance around what is culturally acceptable? I mean, that's a very good question for all the global firms that are in the City of London.
It's a bit of a holy grail, isn't it? I think that's what we're all trying to achieve, is how do you reflect the corporate culture across the geographical diversity of an organization where you have legal and cultural differences. And I think one of the challenges that many firms are facing is how do you collect D&I information? So interestingly, I mean, D&I information varies country to country. In the US, for example, you've got military status. Well, we don't have a veteran status in the UK as a prescribed D&I category. And what is considered a minority ethnic grouping in the UK would not equate to one that would be in a different jurisdiction, say in Indonesia or in India or somewhere else. So that is the challenge. But I think for organizations, we need to work with the cultural differences in each of our jurisdictions, but you've got to have a firm view. I remember when I was at Citi, one of the challenges for our D&I head at the time, and I was very interested in how she answered this, was around LGBTQ. And the firm was very supportive of all colleagues in that way. And the question that she had is, but it's illegal in some countries, and for many of us, we also feel that it's immoral. So, but you, the firm, say that we've got a support group and we've got policies to respect parenting, same-sex parenting, et cetera. How do you reconcile those? And I think as a firm, they came up with, actually, this is what we believe in. We're not going to force you, and where it's illegal, we're not going to make you declare. But what we're going to do is create a framework which enables you to be yourself where you are allowed to be yourself. Can't change the laws, can't change your culture, but in our firm, will allow you to be whoever you are and support you in that. And I think that's probably the way forward. I thought that was really inspiring. And we can only do our best. But I think the piece about diversity is that we're all very different, and we can't make everyone the same. So actually, we have to recognize that diversity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it has indeed been 100 years since female suffrage, and as you mentioned, too little has changed. What do we need beyond quotas to make seismic shifts?
Beyond quotas, gosh, I think we've got a number of initiatives that are proving to be very supportive, like the Women in Finance Charter. But the other piece of it, I think, is very much around role models. And it isn't just senior role models, it's role models everywhere. Because one of the challenges I think that so many people find is when you're on your journey is where do you get your inspiration when you can't see anyone like you who's managed to get there before? Now, sometimes you're going to be breaking new ground because there is nobody there like you who looks like you or who sounds like you, or who has your characteristics. But it really does help when you can see somebody who's actually made it. So one of my role models is Jane Fraser, who is now going to be the CEO of Citi. And I remember when she was in EMEA and head of the private bank, and just the approach she took. You know, she was the first woman I had actually seen in a US investment bank who wore dresses. That was when we all wore skirts and jackets, and occasionally trousers. But she rocked up in a dress, not once, not twice, but most of the time. And I was like, crikey, you know, she can be senior and effective and also reflect her own personal dress style and not conform to this perceived standard. And she's also a role model because it was like, crikey, look at her. She's turned around the private bank. She's incredibly successful, and everything she touched, she did a great job at. And now she's going to be CEO. So I have to say, I certainly wasn't surprised, and I don't think any of her colleagues were surprised that she's going to be CEO. But those role models are really, really important. But I also remember listening to Condoleezza Rice, and she said, you know, where else were you going to find a poor little brown girl in America who managed to get, you know, to the levels that she did in government? And she said, you couldn't. She said, thank goodness for those incredible white male sponsors that I had, because they made the difference. And I think that's the other piece of it is the role models and the sponsors. And in those senior seats in those places where you want to be, many of them are still very populated with one type of male. And what's lovely is that so many of them are tremendous male allies and sponsors. And it's really about their sponsorship that's going to make the difference. They're in the seat, they have the ability to navigate and to make the change happen. So really balls in their court, and I think that's where we need to go.
Do you really think that there are generational differences in what people want in work? People's attitudes have been shown to change over the life course. People in their 20s are more likely to vote Democrats, and those over 40, particularly women, are more likely to be conservative. Maybe younger generations will age and be like all the other workers in finance. God, I hope not. But anyway, Vivienne, take that question.
Well, I don't know. I think I've become far more rebellious with age. And I think, you know, far more focused in terms of what does need to change. I think experience teaches you a lot. I think experience teaches you tolerance. And I mean, tolerance in the very positive sense, not tolerance in terms of not going to do anything about it. The generational diversity is fascinating because we have so many generations in the workforce. And I think when it was just two generations, there wasn't the same challenge and dynamic that there is today when you've got up to 4 generations in the workforce. 2 generations, you can either say, oh, well, you know, you look like my parents or you look like my kids, and you've got experience of both. But when you've got 4 generations, like you don't look like anybody or behave like anybody, I know of directly. This is going to be exciting. And it's a tremendous learning experience. I'm much more optimistic about people. I think you change over time, but I think it's for the best. And I think that we've got a real opportunity with those 4 generations to change in the right way and to inform each other much, much more effectively. So I love reverse mentoring. I just think that is a brilliant idea. We always think it's a top-down approach. Actually, bottom-up is extraordinary, and it can change the minds of senior people in a way that listening to their peers never will. So I'm much more optimistic about that.
You will forgive me, but I've had a few technical issues.
Oh, it's always trying to navigate these boxes and things, isn't it? And I'm always terrified that if I'm going to move around too much, that I might actually just press the wrong one and leave automatically. Which would be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. Now, here's a question for you, which is basically you stayed en route because you're clearly resilient and formidable. But what advice would you give to others attempting to traverse the complex and taxing field of finance who are close to the end of their tethers and feel like throwing in the towel?
Don't throw in the towel. Find somebody to support you. Yes, I'm resilient, but yes, we all have our low moments. There's been times where the challenges before me have honestly brought me to tears, and it's tough. It's tough, but I think anything worth doing, if you're going to really get places, is going to be challenging. We're not all the same. One of the things I think is really important is that going at it with a sledgehammer is usually very ineffective. And I love the analogy of running water. Running water can erode a mountain over time. And if you're not getting where you want to, you're not getting what you want, think of running water. Stop bashing your head against the stone and actually find a way around. But the other part of it is find a network and other people who will give you that support and insight to help you to be more resilient. And that's one of the things I love about Women in Banking and Finance. I, in fact, initially had always steered well clear of women's networks. I thought, honestly, I'm very capable. I don't need to go there. I can do this on my own. Thank you very much. And I'm not really that interested. And it was when I hit the glass ceiling that I suddenly realized, crikey, there's something structural about this. And I need to find out more. So I joined the Women's Network and actually realized that everyone else was also having the same or similar challenges. And it is in that community that I found my strength and determination to go forward, and made some terrific friends and learned so much. And I have to say, from the day I joined the Citi Women's Network until now, as I'm soon to be stepping down as President of Women in Banking and Finance, the most impactful, influential, exciting, fun, challenging times I've had are with my colleagues in those networks and in those organizations. And the impact it's had on my career, I would say, has been immeasurable. I would never have achieved or managed to get to where I am today if it hadn't been for my first step to join a network and to find that support, inspiration, and challenge from everyone else who was there.
And can I add to that, to the lady asking the question, everybody looks at women who've so-called made it and they think, my God, they could deal with anything. And how many of us have cried or have just said, I just can't bear this anymore. And we've made it through for a diversity of reasons. But I think what Vivienne has pointed out is creating that community around you matters hugely. And a lot of those people who look like they've got their act together, behind the scenes, they're struggling just as much as you are. So, and really in life, one needs balance. And I always think it's one of the reasons to work. You work to earn money, you work for intellectual stimulus, because we are talking about professional jobs here, But you also work because in your personal life, when things go wrong, isn't it lovely to have work to escape to? So you never know where happiness comes from. But I think a balanced life is not a bad place to start.
It was actually interesting. One of the survey findings, or the initial findings, was around the importance of work and the value that it brings to many of the female respondents. That actually it's not just to earn money. It really gives you value and identity in your life. Anyway, sorry, Karina.
No. I think this might have to be our last question. And this is wonderful because it brings together data and inclusion. Do you think there are gaps in the data landscape, internal company data collection, which can be used to continue to develop the business case for more inclusive working practices?
There are absolutely gaps in the data. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing with artificial intelligence. So it's interesting, I think, taking a too cautious approach to AI and saying, oh gosh, there's lots of potential risks, let's not do it, is not the way. What we need to do is aware that there's lots of potential risks. So let's have a go, identify them, address them, and then keep moving forward, because the benefits are there as well. So the thing with AI is, or machine learning, is that you can see at speed and with a significant amount of clarity how the data can be distorted or where you are missing data, so that it's giving you extraordinary outcomes that you weren't expecting. We do need to improve our data sets. And it's interesting with the ESG focus that many firms are now embracing, is recognizing that there's a huge amount of data that we just don't have about biodiversity, about our environment. How do we actually measure ESG? And certainly in relation to diversity and inclusion, what we're recognizing is that we need to collect the data in order to understand what is the landscape, and then to analyze the data so that we can make the interventions that we need to in order to change the existing dynamic, and we don't keep repeating the same mistakes that we're making now. So I think the data piece is so utterly critical. We don't have all the data, but interestingly, if we start playing with it, then we'll soon find out where those gaps are, and then we need to go and collect that data and then use it responsibly.
Thank you, Vivienne. This conversation could go on, but unfortunately, time is always a problem. So many thanks to Vivienne Artz, who we look forward to seeing again as our joint project delivers research results and policies to create more inclusive cultures in the city, and not least because Women in Banking and Finance and the Wisdom Council are working with us on this. Now do tune in for our next Open Door, Open City webinars with Alderman Tim Hales, likely to be the city's first openly gay Lord Mayor, with Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith, whose report on social mobility and progression at work is bound to cause a bit of a stir, and with Poppy Jarman, CEO of the City Mental Health Alliance. From all of us here at the Inclusion Initiative, many thanks to Vivienne and to our audience on Zoom and on YouTube. And look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye then.
Pleasure.